Hitler wasn't born the dictator we know today. In fact, in 1910, he was just a homeless man painting postcards in a Vienna charity shelter to survive. But 23 years later, he controlled Germany. And by 1945, his decisions had killed 70 to 80 million people worldwide. This is the complete documented story of that transformation. And understanding it matters because it reveals how democracies collapse and how one individual can cause massive destruction. The man who would become history's most feared dictator began with nothing but failure. Born on April 20, 1889, to a strict Austrian customs officer, Adolf Hitler spent his youth chasing dreams of becoming a great artist. He failed the entrance exam for art school twice, and after his mother died, he was left with no diploma, no family support, and no direction. Throughout his 20s, he drifted without purpose or any real future. By 1910, his situation had become desperate. Hitler lived in a charity shelter for homeless men in Vienna, Austria, surviving by painting small watercolor postcards of city buildings. Jewish art dealers helped him sell these paintings, though he earned barely enough to get by. He owned almost nothing and had no clear path forward. Then came World War I, Germany's defeat and a political awakening fueled by anger. Within 15 years of leaving that homeless shelter, Hitler had changed himself into a political force that conservative politicians believed they could control and use for their own purposes. On January 30, 1933, those politicians appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany through backroom deals. They assumed giving him a government position meant they held the real power. Within 18 months, Hitler had turned Germany into a one-party dictatorship using laws, courts, and emergency decrees to legally destroy democracy. The politicians who appointed him ended up gone, in hiding, or powerless. What followed was destruction on a scale never seen before. According to historical records, 6 million Jews perished in what became known as the Holocaust, while millions more died across occupied Europe. Cities were reduced to rubble, and entire populations were eliminated. By April 30, 1945, when Hitler took his own life in his Berlin bunker, his regime's actions had caused the deaths of 70 to 80 million people worldwide. Yet millions of Germans supported him until the end, while millions more remained silent, even as evidence of terrible acts spread. Democracy died in plain sight as the world watched. This documentary examines this rise to power through verified facts and a documented timeline. The story reveals a pattern: childhood trauma under a strict father, years of failure and homelessness in Vienna, adopting extreme political ideas, purpose found through military service in World War I, and anger created by Germany's defeat. Each phase built on the previous one, creating the conditions for one man to seize control of an entire nation. To understand this transformation, we must start at the beginning in a small Austrian border town where a troubled childhood set everything in motion. Section 1. The Making of a Fanatic. On April 20, 1889, Adolf Hitler was born in Braunau am Inn, Austria, a small town that sat on the border between Austria and Germany. It would later become known only because of him. His father, Alois Hitler, had been born Alois Schicklgruber in 1837. Sometime between 1876 and 1877, he changed his name to Hitler, though the reason remains unclear. What is clear is that Alois climbed from peasant roots to become a respectable Austrian customs officer, and with his uniform came authority. Above all else, he valued order and obedience. His mother, Clara Pölzl Hitler, was Alois's third wife and also his cousin's daughter. Because of this close family connection, the marriage required special permission from the Catholic Church. Devout and protective, Clara was far younger than her husband. Before Adolf survived, she had already lost several children in infancy. Life in the Hitler household was far from nurturing. The home was strict and cold as Alois ruled over his family with an iron hand and expected total obedience from his children. He drank heavily and had little patience for weakness or emotion. Consequently, growing up, Adolf watched his father demand respect through fear. In 1898, when Adolf was 9 years old, the family moved to Leonding, setting the stage for years of conflict. The customs officer had retired, which meant the family now lived in modest comfort near Linz. Despite this improved financial situation, the atmosphere at home remained tense. This strict household produced a boy who would spend his life seeking total control over others. But first, he had to survive his father's demands. Initially, Adolf did well in primary school, and teachers noted his intelligence and quick memory. Yet when he entered secondary school, everything changed. He became undisciplined, rebellious, and lazy, eventually stopping his efforts altogether as his grades collapsed. The reason for this dramatic change was simple. His father wanted him to become a civil servant like himself, while Adolf wanted to become an artist. He dreamed of painting, architecture, and grand buildings as he imagined himself as a great creative genius. In contrast, his father saw this as foolish fantasy. The battle between father and son defined Adolf's teenage years. Rather than rebelling through violence, he chose passive resistance by simply refusing to work. He refused to care about school and refused to accept his father's vision for his future, creating constant tension in the household. Then, on January 3, 1903, Adolf Hitler died suddenly at age 65. He collapsed in a local inn and never woke up. Adolf was 13 years old, and the strict father who had controlled every aspect of family life was gone. Adolf's response was not grief but relief. With his father no longer alive, he no longer had to pretend to care about civil service. As a result, he quit school in 1905 with no diploma at age 16, with no plans, no skills, and no discipline. For the next 2 years, Adolf did nothing productive while living with his mother in Linz. He attended the opera constantly, especially the works of Richard Wagner, and made grand sketches of imaginary buildings. He spent hours with his only friend, August Kubizek, discussing art and music and their future greatness. Yet beneath these grand dreams was a boy who could not finish anything, could not hold a job, and could not face reality. Despite all these failings, he had one obsession that would soon lead to crushing failure: attending Vienna's Academy of Fine Arts. In 1906, Adolf made his first trip to Vienna, the great capital of the Austrian Empire. He toured the city like a tourist, visited museums and opera houses, and absorbed the grandness of imperial architecture. He returned to Linz more convinced than ever that Vienna would make him great. The following year, in October 1907, Adolf Hitler applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. He was 18 years old with no formal training and only his own drawings and his absolute confidence in his talent. To his disappointment, the Academy rejected him. The examiners told him he had drawn too few heads because he could not draw people well. While his architectural sketches were acceptable, his human figures were stiff and lifeless, which led them to suggest he try the School of Architecture instead. Adolf was devastated by this rejection, though he told no one, not even his mother. He kept the rejection secret while pretending everything was fine, unwilling to admit his failure. Meanwhile, worse was coming for the young man as back in Linz, his mother Clara was dying from a severe illness. The disease was spreading rapidly, and although Dr. Eduard Bloch, the family physician, did everything he could, it was not enough to save her. On December 21, 1907, Clara Hitler died at age 47. According to Dr. Bloch, Adolf was the most grief-stricken son he had ever seen. The boy had lost the only person who believed in him and the only person who gave him unconditional love. Adolf now had a small inheritance from his parents, but no job, no diploma, no skills, and no plan. In early 1908, he returned to Vienna determined to try the academy one more time. When he applied again that October, the examiners did not even let him take the entrance exam, as his previous work had been judged too poorly. This was the second rejection in a year, and his situation was becoming desperate. His mother had passed away while his money was running out, and to make matters worse, his friend August Kubizek had been accepted into the Vienna Music Conservatory. Unable to face his failure, Adolf broke off contact with him and disappeared into the city. For months, according to historians, Adolf drifted through Vienna with no direction. He moved from cheap room to cheaper room as he sold the belongings he had brought from Linz. He had no job and no prospects, while being too proud to do manual labor, yet too unskilled to do anything else. By late 1909, the dream had become a nightmare. As his resources ran out completely, Adolf Hitler became homeless. He slept in shelters for the poor, wore ragged clothes, and stood in soup lines, surviving day to day with no resources. In February 1910, he moved into the Vienna Men's Home, which was an organized hostel for poor working men with dormitories, a reading room, and basic facilities. Men could stay as long as they paid a small daily fee. To earn this fee, Adolf survived by painting small watercolor postcards of famous Vienna buildings. He copied scenes from photographs and postcards, then sold them through a partner named Reinhold Hanisch and through Jewish art dealers who worked the tourist areas, earning just enough to pay for his room and food. According to historical records, he never did manual labor despite later myths about being a house painter. He painted small tourist postcards, and this distinction matters because Hitler would later claim he had been a worker and understood the working class, though he never was and never did. For 3 years, from 1910 to 1913, the men's home became Adolf's world. Beyond just providing shelter, it offered a reading room where he spent hours reading newspapers and political pamphlets while listening to arguments about politics, race, and the future of the German-speaking peoples. It was in this environment that extreme ideas began to take root. Vienna at this time was filled with extreme political movements. The Austrian Empire was falling apart as different ethnic groups fought for power and recognition, with Germans, Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, and Jews all competing for control and influence. During these years, Adolf absorbed two political models. The first was Karl Lueger, the mayor of Vienna, who was a populist that used hatred of Jewish people to win elections. He understood how to manipulate mass politics and knew how to turn fear and resentment into votes. The second was Georg von Scherer, a pan-German nationalist who wanted all German-speaking peoples united in one great German nation. He despised the multi-ethnic Austrian Empire while preaching racial purity and German superiority. Over time, Adolf's political views hardened during these years. He became anti-Marxist and blamed socialists and trade unions for workers' problems. He also developed ideas against Jewish people, though historians note these were not yet the organized racial hatred that would come later, particularly after 1919. Nevertheless, documents show that Jewish art dealers helped him survive during this period. He worked with them and sold through them, which meant his views in Vienna were inconsistent and contradictory. The sustained, systematic version of his hatred developed only after World War I, shaped by later events and political circumstances. But the foundation was being laid through failure, humiliation, poverty, resentment, and the desperate need to blame someone else. By 1913, Adolf had had enough of Vienna. While he had received a small inheritance from an aunt, he also faced a growing problem as Austrian authorities wanted him to report for military service, which he had been avoiding for years. In May 1913, Adolf Hitler moved to Munich, Germany, where he rented a small room at 34 Schleißheimerstrasse and continued painting postcards. At age 24, he had accomplished nothing, had no prospects, and was still drifting without purpose. Unfortunately, his escape did not last long. In January 1914, Austrian officials tracked him down and ordered him to report to Salzburg for a military service examination. Adolf had no choice and went. To his relief, the Austrian military examined him and declared him unfit for service because he was too weak and not strong enough to be a soldier. Adolf returned to Munich relieved, knowing he would not have to serve in the Austrian army. Then, 6 months later, everything changed dramatically. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia, followed by a declaration of war on France 2 days later on August 3rd. World War I had begun as Austria-Hungary joined Germany as allies, and within days, the entire continent was at war. Adolf Hitler was in a crowd in Munich when the news arrived. A photograph from that day shows him in the crowd looking excited. For the first time in his adult life, he had found something that truly mattered to him. He immediately volunteered for the Bavarian army. By bureaucratic oversight, he was allowed to enlist even though he was Austrian. The list regiment accepted him, gave him a uniform, and gave him a purpose. Adolf was sent to the Western Front, where his regiment fought in Belgium and France. The fighting was brutal with massive casualties. Within weeks, most of the men who had marched out with him were dead or wounded. On November 3, 1914, Adolf was promoted to corporal and assigned as a dispatch runner. This was his role for the next 4 years. Dispatch runners carried messages between command posts and frontline trenches. The job was dangerous as runners were exposed to artillery fire and snipers. However, they were not in the trenches constantly, as common soldiers were. For 4 years, the man who could not hold a job or finish school became a reliable soldier. The army gave Adolf structure with clear orders and comradeship. For the first time since his mother died, he belonged to something. He was valued and did his job well as his superiors praised his reliability. In 1916, Adolf was wounded at the Battle of the Somme and evacuated to a military hospital at Belitz, Germany. During his recovery, he saw the home front for the first time since the war began, and he observed a very different Germany from the one he had left. Germans were tired of the war as food had become scarce and morale was declining. People complained openly about sacrifices and losses, which Adolf viewed as betrayal of the soldiers at the front. He returned to the front and continued his work as a dispatch runner. On August 4, 1918, he received the Iron Cross First Class, which was a rare decoration for an enlisted man. Most recipients were officers, and in Adolf's case, the decoration was recommended by his superior officer, Lieutenant Hugo Gutmann, who was Jewish. This fact contradicts much of the mythology that would later be created. The man who would preach racial hatred received his highest military honor from a Jewish officer, yet this contradiction was never mentioned in later propaganda. But Adolf's war was about to end in a way that would shape everything that followed. On October 13, 1918, Adolf's unit came under mustard gas attack near Ypres, Belgium. The gas burned his eyes and he was temporarily blinded. He was evacuated to Passewalk Military Hospital in Germany. While he lay in the hospital, Germany fell apart around him. The Kaiser gave up his throne on November 9, 1918, as a republic was announced, and the military leadership asked for an armistice. 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, Germany signed the Armistice Agreement, which meant the war was over and Germany had lost. When Adolf heard the news in the hospital, documents from the time show he was very upset and wept. He felt betrayed because he believed Germany had been winning and the army had been undefeated. In his view, victory had been stolen by politicians and traitors at home. This belief was false. In reality, Germany's military leaders, including General Erich Ludendorff and Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, had asked for the armistice first because the army was exhausted with supplies gone and the Western Front falling apart. The German military could not continue fighting. Despite this reality, Ludendorff and Hindenburg later promoted a different version of events by claiming the army had been stabbed in the back by politicians, socialists, and Jews. According to their story, Germany lost the war not on the battlefield, but through betrayal at home. This became known as the stab-in-the-back myth, which historians recognize as false. Although the myth was false, millions of Germans wanted to believe it, and Adolf Hitler accepted this lie completely. He made it the main part of his political message for the next 25 years, claiming Germany had not lost the war through military defeat, but had been betrayed by specific groups. Those he blamed would eventually pay. Years later, Adolf would claim he had a vision in Passewalk Hospital calling him to save Germany. He would say he knew then that he was meant for greatness, and this story appeared in his book and in later propaganda materials. Historians note this is a self-serving myth. Adolf wrote this account years after the fact, and his actual political program developed in 1919, not 1918, which means the Passewalk vision was invented to make his later success seem meant to be. The truth is simpler. When Adolf left the hospital in late November 1918, he had nowhere to go. The war was over, the empire was gone, and he had no home, no job, and no prospects. At 30 years old, he had accomplished nothing except surviving 4 years of war. Yet, within a year, he would discover the weapon that would change his life, his voice. After his release from the hospital, Adolf returned to Munich, where he found the city in chaos. Germany had become a republic with the Kaiser gone, while different groups competed for power. Communists and socialists fought with nationalists and monarchists as no one knew what Germany would become. Despite this chaos, Adolf stayed with the army. The Reichswehr, the new German military, kept him on the payroll because they needed men they could trust. Adolf was reliable with no politics except loyalty to the military, which led them to give him a new assignment. In the summer of 1919, the army sent Adolf to a special course that trained soldiers to give anti-Bolshevik lectures to other troops. Germany's military leaders feared communism and wanted soldiers who could explain why Marxism was dangerous. Adolf attended the course and discovered something remarkable. He could speak in front of crowds, hold their attention, make them listen, and channel emotion through words. In August 1919, Adolf was sent to a camp at Lechfeld to instruct troops, and his lectures were powerful. Soldiers responded to his confidence and passion, and officers took notice of his speaking ability. As a result, he was given more assignments to lecture troops. The failed artist had found what he was good at, not painting or architecture, but speaking. The army then used Adolf as a spy by sending him to observe political groups in Munich. The military wanted to know who was organizing, who had influence, and who might be useful or dangerous to their interests. On September 12, 1919, Adolf attended a meeting of a tiny group called the German Workers' Party. About 25 people sat in a beer hall, and the founder was Anton Drexler, a locksmith. The group mixed strong German pride with anti-business ideas and hatred of Jewish people. During the meeting, Adolf spoke up during a debate, and Drexler was impressed by his passion and knowledge. After the meeting, Drexler invited Adolf to join the party. Adolf thought about it for a few days and then accepted the offer. At this point, the German Workers' Party was nothing. It had no money, no headquarters, no membership list, and no influence, making it one of dozens of small extreme groups in Munich. Adolf later created a story about being member number 7, though the party ledger, which used a 500 prefix to make their numbers look bigger, actually recorded him as member number 555. Despite this, Adolf saw opportunity in the party's weakness. Because the party was so small, he could reshape it completely according to his vision. Over the following months, Adolf became the party's main speaker. He gave speeches in beer halls and drew crowds as people came to hear him talk about betrayal, Jewish people, Marxists, and the Treaty of Versailles. His speeches were emotional, angry, and simple, giving audiences someone to blame for Germany's problems. On September 16, 1919, Adolf wrote a letter that showed his views had become systematic and organized. He wrote to a fellow army man named Adolf Gemlich, and the letter laid out his views on Jews in clear terms. He called for the removal of Jews through rational policy, not emotional violence. This letter is significant because it shows that by September 1919, Adolf Hitler had developed race-based hatred that went beyond casual prejudice, which historians recognize as part of the extreme ideology that would lead to terrible atrocities. On February 24, 1920, the party announced its 25-point program at the Hofbräuhaus beer hall in Munich. Adolf had helped write it, and the program demanded that all German-speaking peoples be united in one nation. It also demanded that the Treaty of Versailles be abolished and that Jews be excluded from German citizenship and the German press, while calling for a strong central government. Soon after, the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The awkward name would later be shortened to refer to the party with those beliefs, and they adopted the swastika as their symbol, twisting an ancient symbol into a new emblem of hate. As these changes took place, the movement was beginning to take clear shape. To protect their growing influence, the party formed a military-style group called the Sturmabteilung, or SA. At first, the SA provided hall protection at meetings, which meant they beat up hecklers and disrupted opponents' events. Street violence became a tool for publicity as the SA wore brown shirts and started fights, with each fight making headlines and each headline bringing more attention to the movement. In December 1920, the party expanded its reach further by purchasing a newspaper called the Völkischer Beobachter with help from army-linked funds. By early 1923, it had become a daily paper, which meant the movement now had a way to spread its message beyond beer halls to a much wider audience. Adolf attracted wealthy supporters and military connections that helped the party grow. Dietrich Eckart, a journalist and playwright, introduced him to wealthy Munich society, while Ernst Röhm, an army officer, provided weapons and military networks. As a result, the party grew from dozens to hundreds to thousands of members. However, in the summer of 1921, the party faced an internal power struggle. Some members wanted to merge with other groups, but Adolf threatened to quit unless he was given total control. He demanded the title of chairman with dictatorial powers, and faced with losing their most effective speaker, the committee gave in. Adolf now controlled the party completely. This moment revealed his method for gaining and keeping power: one leader, no debate, and total authority. The principle was called the Führer principle, the leader principle, and Adolf would use this model to run first the party and eventually Germany itself. By 1921, Adolf Hitler controlled a small party of extremists in Munich with only a few thousand members. Within 12 years, he would control an entire nation. 5 factors shaped the man who would become a dictator, and understanding them reveals how he rose to power. First, failure shaped him through art school rejection, homelessness, and poverty. Years of humiliation with no one to help taught him to hate everyone who had succeeded where he had failed, creating deep anger that would fuel his later actions. Second, war gave him purpose. For 4 years, Adolf felt valued as he belonged, wore a uniform, followed orders, and was praised for being reliable. War was the only time in his life he felt useful, which is why he would always look back on it fondly. Third, defeat gave him a target for his anger. When Germany lost the war, Adolf needed someone to blame. He accepted the stab-in-the-back myth and blamed Jews, Marxists, and the politicians who signed the armistice. These became his enemies for life, though historians recognize this blame was based on false propaganda rather than historical fact. Fourth, the army gave him training. The Reichswehr taught him how to give speeches and how propaganda worked, while paying him to spread anti-communist ideas. Without realizing it, the military created the tool that would eventually destroy them. Finally, the party gave him a vehicle for his ambitions. The German Workers' Party was small enough for one man to control, which allowed Adolf to reshape it into his image by turning a beer hall discussion group into a movement. He added the swastika, the SA, and the public displays that drew attention. A clear pattern had emerged by this point. Adolf Hitler blamed others for his failures and wanted total control over everything. He was a gifted speaker who turned anger into words that moved crowds. He was willing to use violence as a tool, and he was building stories about himself that made him seem special. In these stories, the failed artist became a war hero, the homeless drifter became a great thinker, and the man with no real accomplishments claimed he was chosen by fate to save Germany. But in 1921, he was still nothing more than a small-time political speaker in Munich. He was the head of a party with a few thousand members, yet within 12 years, he would control an entire nation. The answer to this rise lies in crisis, violence, and the men who thought they could use him for their own purposes. Germany's democracy was weak from the start, and economic disasters would destroy what little stability it had. Conservatives would make a deadly mistake by opening the door and inviting him in, believing they could control him once he had power. They would learn they were wrong, but by then, it would be too late to stop what they had started. The next stage of Adolf Hitler's rise would show something important about how democracies fail. They rarely fall to military takeovers or sudden coups. Instead, they collapse from within through legal means, dying in legislative chambers and courtrooms when institutions fail and good people do nothing to stop the process. That story begins with the collapse of Germany's first democracy and the chaos that followed World War I, revealing patterns that help us understand how democratic systems can break down even today. Section 2. How democracy collapsed. The chaos Hitler would exploit began years before he had any real power. It started on a single day in November 1918, when Germany's old order collapsed and nothing solid rose to replace it. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II gave up his throne and fled Germany by train. The German Empire died with him. That same day, a socialist politician named Philipp Scheidemann rushed to a window of the Reichstag building in Berlin and proclaimed Germany a republic. The announcement was unplanned, and no one had prepared for this moment. As a result, Germany had a democracy by accident. The new government faced immediate problems. The war was lost, the economy was collapsing, and soldiers were returning home to find no jobs and no food. Revolutionary councils formed in cities across Germany. Some wanted a communist revolution like Russia had just experienced. Others wanted the Kaiser back. Almost everyone was angry. To maintain control, the leaders of the new republic made a secret deal. On November 9, 1918, the same day the Republic was proclaimed, socialist leader Friedrich Ebert met with General Wilhelm Groener. Ebert headed the new government while Groener commanded what remained of the German military. They made an agreement. The army would support the new government and help maintain order, and in exchange, the government would leave the military alone. Officers who still supported the monarchy would keep their positions and their power. This bargain poisoned German democracy from the start. The Ebert-Groener Pact poisoned the Republic from the start. The military had agreed to support the new government, but its officers never stopped hating everything the Republic stood for. They called it a betrayal of Germany, yet these were the very men the Republic needed to survive. It was a fatal contradiction that would never be resolved. The courts posed the same problem. Most judges had built their careers serving the Kaiser, and they carried their old loyalties into the new system. When political violence erupted across Germany, their bias became impossible to ignore. Right-wing terrorists walked free or received slaps on the wrist, while left-wing protesters faced execution or years in prison for far lesser offenses. Government offices told the same story. The bureaucrats who had run the Kaiser's administration simply stayed at their desks under new management. Many of them quietly sabotaged the democracy they were supposed to serve, slowing reforms and undermining policies while waiting for the whole experiment to collapse. Germany had created democratic laws, but the men enforcing those laws despised democracy itself. The government still needed a constitution, but writing one in Berlin was out of the question. Street battles between communists and right-wing militias had turned the capital into a war zone, so politicians traveled to the quieter city of Weimar to do their work. The Weimar Constitution was adopted on July 31, 1919, and it created a parliamentary democracy. Under this new constitution, citizens would elect representatives to the Reichstag, the German parliament, which would pass laws while the president served as head of state. On paper, it was a functioning democracy, but the constitution contained a dangerous flaw. Article 48 gave the president emergency powers that allowed him to suspend civil rights and rule by decree without parliament during a crisis. The framers intended this as a temporary measure for genuine emergencies and assumed presidents would use it rarely. Instead, Article 48 became a regular tool of government, with presidents relying on emergency decrees rather than working with elected representatives. Over time, Germans grew used to rule by decree, and the practice of bypassing parliament became normal. While the government struggled to function, the republic faced attacks from all sides. Communists attempted revolutions in several cities, right-wing militias staged coups, and political murders became routine. Between 1919 and 1923, hundreds of politicians and activists died from political violence. The Republic had enemies everywhere, but the judges who were supposed to protect democracy consistently sided with those enemies instead. The case of Wolfgang Kapp illustrates this problem. In 1921, this right-wing army officer led a coup attempt in Berlin and occupied the government quarter. The regular army refused to stop him, and the coup only collapsed when workers went on strike. After his arrest, Kapp faced trial but received a light sentence. The workers who had saved the Republic, however, faced harsh punishment. Hundreds were arrested, and many received long prison terms. The justice system had made its loyalties clear. It tolerated right-wing violence while crushing left-wing resistance. This double standard had deadly consequences. Between 1919 and 1922, right-wing extremists were responsible for 354 politically motivated casualties. 326 went unpunished. By contrast, 22 left-wing deaths led to 10 executions and multiple long prison sentences. As a result, extremists learned that violence achieved results, while Democrats learned that institutions failed to protect them. Adolf Hitler watched all of this unfold and learned from it. He saw that judges forgave right-wing crimes, that the army refused to defend the Republic, and that weakness existed at every level of the system. He decided to use these failures to his advantage. But before Hitler could exploit the Republic's weakness, the new German government faced an impossible task. They had to sign a peace treaty that Germans across the political spectrum despised. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, when representatives from the victorious Allies gathered in France. Germany was not allowed to negotiate, and German diplomats could only accept or reject the terms as presented. Rejection would mean the war would resume, but Germany had no army left to fight, so they signed. The terms were harsh. Germany lost significant territory, with Alsace-Lorraine going to France and Posen, and West Prussia going to the new nation of Poland. This created the Polish Corridor, a strip of land that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, while the city of Danzig became a free city under League of Nations control. Germany also lost all its overseas colonies. The military restrictions were equally severe. Germany's army was limited to 100,000 men, and the treaty banned tanks, aircraft, and submarines entirely. The Rhineland, the region bordering France, was permanently stripped of military forces, and no German troops could ever enter this zone. But the financial penalties proved even more devastating than the lost territory. Germany owed reparations of 132 billion gold marks, roughly $442 billion in today's money. These payments were meant to compensate the Allies for war damages, though in practice Germany paid only a fraction of this amount. The Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929 reduced payments significantly, and many obligations were suspended or abandoned entirely in the 1930s. Even more damaging to German pride was Article 231, known as the War Guilt Clause. This provision forced Germany to accept sole responsibility for starting the war, and every German political party rejected the claim. They believed all European powers shared blame for the conflict. The treaty humiliated Germany, but it is essential to understand the full context. Just 1 year earlier, Germany had imposed a far harsher treaty on Russia. In March 1918, Germany forced Russia to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which stripped away about 34% of Russia's population, 54% of its industry, and 89% of its coal production. Russia lost territory equal to the combined size of Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, along with 73% of its iron ore, 5,000 factories, and an obligation to pay Germany 6 billion marks in reparations. By any measure, Brest-Litovsk was far more severe than Versailles. Yet the same German leaders who had celebrated that treaty now condemned Versailles as an unforgivable injustice. The problem was not that Versailles was uniquely harsh. The real problem was not the treaty itself, but how Germany's leaders responded to it. Rather than admit they had lost militarily, they promoted what became known as the stab-in-the-back myth, blaming civilians for the defeat. This lie had terrible consequences. Germans came to believe their army had never been defeated in battle, and that traitors at home had surrendered while the front still held. Under this version of events, Versailles was not the price of losing a war, but theft imposed on an undefeated nation. The story was completely false. Germany's own generals had requested the armistice because they knew the military situation was hopeless. General Ludendorff and Field Marshal Hindenburg understood the war was lost, but they let civilian politicians sign the documents and then blamed those same politicians for accepting peace. The lie worked because millions of Germans wanted to believe it. Adolf Hitler built his entire political career on this myth. He told crowds that Germany had been stabbed in the back and named the supposed culprits: socialists who had formed the Republic, politicians who signed the armistice, Jews who he claimed controlled finance and media, and Marxists who stirred up workers. In Hitler's version of events, Germany had not lost the war but had been betrayed, and the Treaty of Versailles was not a peace agreement, but a crime imposed by international conspirators. This message connected with millions of Germans who felt the sting of defeat. Veterans felt betrayed, middle-class citizens felt humiliated, and nationalists felt robbed. The treaty became a convenient target for every problem Germany faced, and whenever the economy struggled, workers went on strike, or unemployment rose, extremists pointed at Versailles as the cause. The treaty did not cause all of Germany's problems, but it gave extremists a target to attack and a lie to sell. By 1923, Germany faced total economic collapse. The crisis began when France decided to occupy the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, after Germany fell behind on reparation payments. French troops marched in to seize coal and steel directly. The German government responded by calling for passive resistance, and workers in the Ruhr went on strike, refusing to work for French occupiers. To pay these striking workers, the government began printing money, a decision that destroyed what remained of Germany's currency. Inflation spiraled out of control. In January 1923, $1 equaled 17,000 German marks, but by November of that same year, $1 equaled 4.2 trillion marks. Money had become worthless. The human cost was staggering. Germans carried money in wheelbarrows just to buy bread, and savings accounts that had taken decades to build vanished overnight. A lifetime of careful saving could no longer purchase a single loaf. People who had pensions, savings, or bonds lost everything they had. Workers began demanding daily wages because money lost value by the hour, and restaurants changed their menu prices between lunch and dinner. The middle class, which had always been the backbone of German society, was financially destroyed. The psychological damage was enormous. Germans had already endured defeat, revolution, and political chaos, and now their life savings had vanished as well. Hunger spread across the country, desperation grew, and trust in government collapsed completely. This disaster created the conditions Adolf Hitler needed. Bavaria, the region where Munich was located, had become a center of right-wing opposition to the national government. Three men controlled the region in 1923. Gustav von Kahr served as state commissioner, Otto von Lossow commanded the Bavarian military, and Hans Ritter von Ziesser led the state police. All three openly defied the national government in Berlin. Hitler saw an opportunity. His Nazi party had grown during the crisis, and the SA, his paramilitary force, now numbered in the thousands. He believed he could unite all right-wing forces in Bavaria and march on Berlin, just as Mussolini had marched on Rome the previous year in Italy. On November 8, 1923, Hitler made his move. Kahr was speaking at a large political meeting in the Burgerbräukeller, a famous beer hall in Munich, when Hitler and armed SA men burst into the hall. Hitler fired a pistol into the ceiling and announced that the revolution had begun. He then took Kahr, Lossow, and Ziesser into a back room at gunpoint and demanded they join his coup. General Erich Ludendorff, the famous World War I commander, arrived to lend his support, and under pressure, the three Bavarian leaders agreed. Once released, however, Kahr, Lossow, and Ziesser changed their minds. They slipped away, organized opposition, called the police, and declared Hitler's coup illegal. The next morning, November 9th, Hitler led a march through Munich, believing his show of force would rally support. Instead, police blocked the march at the Feldherrnhalle, a memorial in central Munich, and shooting broke out. 16 Nazis and 3 police officers died, and the beer hall putsch collapsed. Hitler fell and injured his shoulder in the chaos before being arrested 2 days later. The coup had failed completely, and he now faced trial for treason with a maximum sentence of life in prison. His political career appeared to be over, yet the trial became his greatest propaganda victory. The judges were sympathetic to right-wing causes and allowed Hitler to speak for hours, giving him a platform to turn the courtroom into a stage for his political message. Rather than deny leading the coup, Hitler attacked the Republic itself, claiming he was a patriot trying to save Germany and arguing that the real criminals were the politicians who had signed the armistice and accepted Versailles. The trial lasted from February 26 to April 1, 1924, and newspapers across Germany printed Hitler's speeches throughout. By the time it ended, he had transformed from a regional agitator into a national figure, with his name appearing in papers from Berlin to Hamburg. The failed coup had made him famous. The sentence itself was absurdly light. Hitler received 5 years in Landsberg prison but was eligible for parole after just 6 months, and the judges made clear they sympathized with his goals, even if they could not openly approve his methods. In the end, Hitler served only 9 months in comfortable conditions. He received visitors, gifts, and letters of support, and he used his time to dictate a book to his loyal follower Rudolf Hess. The book was called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, and it laid out Hitler's entire worldview. He explained his racial theories, arguing that history was a struggle between races in which the Aryan race was superior to all others. Jews, he claimed, were the ultimate enemy and responsible for every problem in the world. He called for Lebensraum, or living space, meaning Germany needed to conquer territory in Eastern Europe to thrive. The book also explained his propaganda techniques. He wrote that effective propaganda must be simple and repetitive, appealing to emotion rather than reason. It must identify clear enemies and offer simple solutions to complex problems. Finally, Hitler described what he called the Führerprinzip, or leader principle. He believed democracy was inherently weak because it required debate and compromise, and that strong nations needed one absolute leader who commanded total obedience. Early sales of Mein Kampf were modest, with only about 9,000 copies sold in 1925. But as the Nazi Party grew, sales increased dramatically, and by the time Hitler became Chancellor, the book had made him wealthy. Every German couple marrying was expected to own a copy, and eventually millions were printed. Everything Hitler would later do was described in this book: the racial laws, the persecution of Jews, the plan to conquer Eastern Europe, the rejection of democracy, and the cult of the leader. He wrote it all down in 1924, yet few people took it seriously. While in prison, Hitler also made a critical strategic decision. He concluded that armed coups did not work in Germany because the military was too strong and the police too loyal to the state. Any future coup would fail, just as the beer hall putsch had failed. Thus, he decided on a different path. He would take power legally. On December 20th, 1924, Hitler was released from Landsberg prison after serving just 9 months. He emerged with a clear plan. He would build the Nazi Party into a mass movement, win elections, and use democracy to destroy democracy. First, however, he had to rebuild. The Nazi Party had been banned after the putsch, and the movement had broken apart in his absence as different factions competed for control. Hitler needed to reassert his authority over all of them. On February 16, 1925, the ban on the Nazi Party was lifted, and 11 days later, Hitler held a refounding rally at the same beer hall where the putsch had begun. Thousands attended, and he made his position absolutely clear. He was the sole leader, and no one could question his authority. The Führerprinzip became the party's organizing principle. Hitler alone made decisions, and all members owed personal loyalty to him rather than to the party itself. There would be no democracy within the party, no debates, and no votes on policy. Hitler's word was law, and this structure would eventually extend across all of Germany. But first, he had to build the machine that would make this possible. Many German states banned Hitler from speaking in public because they feared his ability to incite crowds, and these bans lasted from 1925 to 1927 in most regions. Rather than sit idle, Hitler used this time to organize. While he could not speak, he built a shadow government. The Nazi Party was structured like a state. Germany was divided into regions called Gaue. Each Gau had a leader called a Gauleiter, who each Gauleiter reported directly to Hitler. And under the Gaue were districts called Kreise, which were further divided into local groups called Ortsgruppen. The party also created separate divisions for every aspect of society. Joseph Goebbels led the propaganda branch. Baldur von Schirach controlled the youth unit, and dedicated divisions handled women's affairs, education, labor, and agriculture. The party even established shadow government departments staffed with Nazi experts on economics, foreign policy, justice, and racial policy. These departments held no official power yet, but they stood ready to take over government functions the moment the party gained control. To maintain discipline, the party built its own internal court system. The Uschla, or Investigation and Settlement Committee, handled disputes, kept scandals quiet, punished members who embarrassed the party, and enforced absolute obedience to Hitler. Meanwhile, the SA continued to grow. These brown-shirted street fighters numbered in the tens of thousands by the late 1920s, and they served as the party's muscle. They fought communists in the streets, disrupted opposition meetings, and created the kind of chaos that made ordinary Germans crave order. In 1925, Hitler created a smaller, more elite force called the Schutzstaffel, or SS, which originally served as his personal bodyguard. In 1929, Heinrich Himmler took command, and under his leadership the SS grew into the most feared organization in Germany. By 1929, the Nazi Party was not just a political movement. It was a parallel state waiting to seize power. In February 1926, the party faced an internal crisis when Gregor Strasser, who led the Northern Nazi organization, began pushing to emphasize the socialist aspect of National Socialism. He and his followers wanted to seize wealthy estates and nationalize major industries in pursuit of a true workers' revolution. Hitler crushed this faction at a meeting in Bamberg on February 14, 1926, making his position clear: the leader determined policy, not the program. The 25-point program from 1920 was officially unchangeable, but Hitler alone would interpret what it meant. Joseph Goebbels had initially supported Strasser, but Hitler won him over at Bamberg and then sent him to Berlin to build the party there. Goebbels went on to become one of Hitler's most loyal followers and most effective propagandists. Between 1925 and 1929, the Nazi Party grew steadily but remained on the margins of German politics. In the May 1928 election, the party won only 810,000 votes and 12 seats in the Reichstag out of nearly 40 million voters. The Nazis were still a fringe movement, and the party needed crisis to grow. Hitler's message worked when people were desperate, and anger, fear, and economic collapse were his best recruiters. In prosperous times, voters simply ignored him. Then, in October 1929, everything changed. On October 24, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed, triggering a chain reaction as banks failed and credit froze. The global economy entered a catastrophic depression, and Germany was particularly vulnerable because its economy depended heavily on American loans. When those loans stopped, German banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment exploded. In 1929, Germany had about 1.3 million unemployed workers. By 1930, that number hit 3 million, and by 1932, 6 million Germans were out of work, representing 1/3 of the entire workforce. The middle class had already lost their savings in the 1923 hyperinflation, and now they lost their jobs as well. People who had worked their entire lives found themselves begging for food, families lost their homes, and hunger spread across the country until desperation finally turned to rage. The Weimar political system collapsed under the pressure. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning attempted to govern using Article 48 emergency powers, ruling by presidential decree rather than working with parliament. This approach normalized dictatorship, and Germans grew used to government without democracy. President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging World War I hero, signed decree after decree as parliament was pushed aside and political parties became irrelevant. The republic was dying, but few noticed because they were focused on economic survival. Adolf Hitler saw opportunity in the chaos. Germans wanted someone to blame, and he gave them enemies. His message was simple: Germany's problems were caused by outside forces. The Treaty of Versailles had crippled the economy. International Jewish bankers controlled finance. Marxists stirred up workers and created chaos. And the November criminals, who had created the Republic, were traitors. Hitler also promised simple solutions. He would tear up the Treaty of Versailles, restore German pride, create jobs, build a strong military, and unite all Germans in one powerful nation. Most importantly, he promised strong leadership in place of parliamentary chaos. By this point, the Nazi propaganda machine had become highly effective. Joseph Goebbels controlled the party's messaging and organized massive rallies designed for maximum impact. Brown-shirted SA men marched in formation, swastika flags lined the streets, and Hitler delivered lengthy speeches to crowds of thousands. The September 14, 1930 election changed everything. The Nazi Party won 18.3% of the vote and gained 107 seats in the Reichstag, leaping from the 9th largest party to the 2nd largest. 6.4 million Germans had voted for the Nazis, and the party had gone from marginal to major in a single election. Hitler was now a force that could not be ignored. But context matters. The Nazis won just over 18% of the vote, which meant more than 81% of Germans voted for other parties. The Nazis did not have a majority and were not even close to one. Yet politicians and journalists began treating Hitler as inevitable, and this was a fatal error. After the 1930 election, Hitler gained new legitimacy. Industrialists and landowners who had previously ignored him now paid attention, and some began donating money to the party. They feared communism more than they feared the Nazis, and believed Hitler could be controlled and used to stop the left. Hitler cultivated this impression carefully by emphasizing law and order when he met with business leaders and downplaying the socialist parts of his program. He promised to restore business confidence and suppress labor unions. When he spoke to crowds, however, he used completely different language. He attacked capitalism as the tool of Jewish bankers, promised to break the power of big corporations, and positioned himself as the champion of ordinary workers. Hitler told each audience what it wanted to hear, and many people thought they could use him for their own purposes. In 1932, Hitler decided to run for president. He was still stateless, having given up Austrian citizenship in 1925, but a friendly state government in Braunschweig solved this problem by appointing him to a meaningless position that made him a German citizen. On February 25, 1932, Hitler officially became German. The presidential election took place in March and April 1932, with 84-year-old Paul von Hindenburg running for re-election. Hindenburg won both rounds of voting, receiving 53% in the second round on April 10th, while Hitler got just under 37%. Hitler had lost, but his vote total had increased dramatically, with nearly 14 million Germans voting for him. The Nazis were now the largest single movement in Germany, and fear of the Nazis combined with fascination with Hitler dominated political discussion. On July 31, 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag. They won 37.3% of the vote and gained 230 seats. But again, context matters. 37% was their peak, meaning 63% of Germans had voted for other parties. The Nazis had no majority, and Hitler could not form a government without coalition partners. President Hindenburg refused to appoint Hitler as Chancellor. On August 13, 1932, Hitler met with Hindenburg and demanded the chancellorship. Hindenburg refused, and the old field marshal made his contempt clear by calling Hitler the Bohemian corporal, a sneer at his Austrian origins and low wartime rank. The Nazi movement now faced crisis. Party finances were exhausted, members were tired, and some began questioning whether the strategy was working. On August 23rd, 5 SA men murdered a communist worker in the town of Potempa in front of his family. They were convicted and sentenced to death, but Hitler sent them a telegram expressing solidarity and calling them heroes. Their sentences were later reduced, sending a clear message that the Nazis supported violence against their enemies. In November 1932, Germany held elections again, and this time the Nazi vote dropped to 33.1%. They lost 2 million votes and 34 seats, and the party's momentum had stalled. Internal disputes erupted when Gregor Strasser, who led the party's organization, proposed joining a coalition government even without Hitler as chancellor. Hitler rejected this completely, and on December 8, 1932, Strasser resigned from all party positions. Hitler crushed the rebellion by gathering party leaders and giving them a choice: loyalty to him or expulsion. Everyone fell in line and Strasser was politically destroyed, but the financial and political crisis deepened and the Nazis appeared to be losing. Behind closed doors, conservative politicians made a fateful decision. They would bring Hitler into government because they believed they could control him. They were wrong. The key figure was Franz von Papen, an aristocratic conservative who had briefly served as chancellor earlier in 1932. He despised democracy and believed in rule by elite conservatives. Another key figure was Kurt von Schleicher, an army general and political manipulator who had spent years pulling strings behind the scenes. He believed he could use Hitler's popularity while controlling his actions. In late 1932 and early January 1933, these men held secret meetings. On January 4, 1933, Papen met with Hitler at the home of banker Baron Kurt von Schroeder in Cologne, where they discussed a deal. Hitler would become Chancellor, Papen would be Vice-Chancellor, and conservative politicians would fill most cabinet positions. The conservatives believed this arrangement gave them control because there would be only 3 Nazis in the cabinet, while 8 positions went to conservatives. They thought they had boxed Hitler in. On January 22, 1933, Papen met with Hitler again at the home of Joachim von Ribbentrop in Berlin, with Oskar von Hindenburg, the president's son, also present. Papen and others worked to convince Oskar that Hitler could be managed. Meanwhile, Schleicher had become Chancellor himself, but could not form a stable government because he had no support in Parliament, and his scheming had made him enemies everywhere. On January 28, 1933, Schleicher resigned. Hindenburg now faced a choice that would determine Germany's future. The political system was paralyzed, with no party holding a majority and no coalition able to form. Street violence was increasing, and the country seemed on the verge of civil war. Papen convinced Hindenburg that Hitler offered a solution. The Nazis were the largest party. Bringing Hitler into government would provide popular support, and the conservatives would keep him under control. On January 30, 1933, at noon, President Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. That evening, thousands of SA men marched through Berlin in a torchlight parade to celebrate their victory, while conservatives watched and smiled, believing they had won. The conservatives thought positions equaled power because they held most cabinet seats, had the president's ear, and controlled the army. They believed Hitler's title meant nothing without their support. They fundamentally misunderstood how power worked. Hitler controlled a mass movement of millions and commanded the SA, which numbered hundreds of thousands. He had mastered propaganda, knew how to manipulate crowds, and was willing to use violence without hesitation. By mid-1933, conservative opponents were politically pushed aside through arrests, intimidation, and exile. Many of the remaining power brokers were eliminated or neutralized in the purge of June 30th to July 2nd, 1934, known as the Night of the Long Knives. 5 factors destroyed German democracy and enabled Hitler's rise. First, the Republic was weak from birth. The Ebert-Groener Pact kept anti-democratic elites in power, and judges, generals, and bureaucrats undermined democracy from within. Article 48 normalized emergency rule without parliament, and the institutions that should have protected democracy refused to do so. Second, economic disaster created desperation. Hyperinflation in 1923 destroyed the middle class, and the Great Depression destroyed their jobs. People who had worked their entire lives found themselves hungry and homeless, and desperate people listened to extremists. Third, political violence was tolerated. Right-wing terrorism faced light punishment, and the beer hall putsch resulted in less than a year in comfortable prison for Hitler, while left-wing protesters were crushed. This double standard encouraged extremists. Fourth, the conservative elites made a fatal bargain. They believed they could use Hitler's popularity while controlling his actions, and they thought positions meant power. They were wrong. Fifth, millions of Germans voted for Hitler even though they knew his goals. He had written Mein Kampf, spoken openly about destroying the Weimar Republic, supported street violence, and made clear his hatred of Jews, Marxists, and democracy itself. None of this was secret. Yet millions voted for him anyway. Some supported his entire program. Others thought they could get what they wanted and avoid what they feared. And many simply wanted change and believed Hitler offered strength. On January 30th, 1933, democracy had one last chance. President Hindenburg could have refused Hitler, the army could have stopped the appointment, and conservative politicians could have said no. None of them did. They opened the door and invited him in, believing they could manage him. What happened next would show how democracies die, not through military coups, but through laws, courts, and paperwork. Section 3. The legal destruction of democracy. Adolf Hitler became Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, but he did not immediately seize dictatorial power. He moved carefully at first because he understood that one false step could unite his enemies against him. Hitler controlled only 3 positions in the cabinet. Hermann Göring served as minister without portfolio and also as Prussian interior minister. Wilhelm Frick was interior minister, and Hitler himself was chancellor. The other 8 cabinet positions belonged to conservatives who believed they controlled the government. But Hitler had advantages his partners did not recognize. He controlled the Nazi Party organization, which had millions of members, and he commanded the SA, which had hundreds of thousands of brown-shirted street fighters. He had Joseph Goebbels running propaganda, and most importantly, he understood how to use crisis to gain power. Hitler's first move was to call new elections for March 5, 1933, because he wanted a Nazi majority in the Reichstag. With a majority, he could pass laws without needing coalition partners. As Prussian Interior Minister, Hermann Göring controlled the police in Prussia, Germany's largest state. He immediately purged police leadership, appointed Nazis to key positions, and ordered police to support the SA rather than restrain them. As a result, SA violence increased dramatically. Brown shirts attacked opposition party offices, disrupted socialist and communist meetings, and beat up political opponents in the streets while the police did nothing to stop them. Then came the event that changed everything. On the evening of February 27, 1933, the Reichstag building in Berlin caught fire. The Parliament building burned for hours, and when firefighters finally controlled the blaze, much of the building was destroyed. Police found a man inside the burning building named Marinus van der Lubbe, a Dutch communist who had matches and fire-starting materials. He confessed to starting the fire. Hitler and Göring immediately claimed the fire was the beginning of a communist uprising and declared a national emergency. Historians continue to debate who actually started the Reichstag fire. Some believe van der Lubbe acted alone, while others suspect the Nazis set it up as an excuse for emergency measures. The evidence remains unclear, but what is certain is how the Nazis used the fire. They exploited it to destroy their opponents and suspend civil liberties. On February 28, 1933, just one day after the fire, President Hindenburg signed an emergency decree that destroyed German democracy. The decree was officially called the Decree for the Protection of People and State, but it is known to history as the Reichstag Fire Decree. This single decree suspended all basic civil liberties. Freedom of speech was ended. Freedom of the press was abolished, freedom of assembly was prohibited, and the right to privacy in mail and telephone communication was eliminated. Protection from arbitrary arrest was removed entirely. The decree allowed police to arrest anyone for any reason without trial, permitted searches without warrants, and gave the government power to shut down newspapers and ban political meetings. It also authorized the seizure of property without legal process. The decree was supposed to be temporary, but it was never repealed. For the next 12 years, until Germany's defeat in 1945, these emergency powers remained in effect, and German citizens had no constitutional rights. In the first 24 hours alone, approximately 4,000 communists were arrested, with thousands more detained in the following days. Police, assisted by the SA, rounded up socialist leaders, trade union officials, and journalists critical of the Nazis. The arrests were justified as protective custody, but victims had no trial, no lawyers, and no way to appeal. They simply disappeared into police stations, improvised jails, and newly created detention camps. On March 22, 1933, Heinrich Himmler announced the opening of Dachau, a concentration camp near Munich that would hold political prisoners indefinitely without trial. Dachau was the first permanent concentration camp, and many more would follow. Terror had become government policy. The March 5, 1933 election took place in this atmosphere of violence and intimidation. communist leaders were in jail or hiding, socialist newspapers were shut down, and opposition rallies were banned or broken up by the SA while the police helped the Nazis and harassed their opponents. Despite all this, the Nazi Party did not win a majority. They received 43.9% of the vote, giving them 288 seats in the Reichstag. The Social Democrats still received 18.3%. The Communists won 12.3% despite the persecution, and the Catholic Center Party actually gained votes with 11.2%. Even with complete control of government resources, total intimidation, and mass arrests, the majority of Germans voted against the Nazis. This fact is crucial to understanding what followed. Hitler never won majority support in a free election. He gained power through appointment by conservative elites and maintained it through emergency decrees, violence, and ultimately by destroying democracy itself. After the March 5th election, Hitler needed a way to govern without parliamentary approval. The Reichstag still existed, other parties still held seats, and in theory, they could block Nazi legislation. Hitler wanted unlimited power to pass laws without the Reichstag, and to do this, he needed the Enabling Act. Before pushing the Enabling Act through, Hitler staged an elaborate propaganda ceremony. On March 21, 1933, a special event was held in Potsdam at the historic Garrison Church. The ceremony was called the Day of Potsdam, and it was designed to link the Nazi regime to Prussia's military tradition. President Hindenburg attended in his old field marshal uniform while Hitler wore a morning coat, and the two men shook hands in front of cameras. The symbolism was deliberate. The old Germany, represented by Hindenburg and the military, was blessing the new Germany led by Hitler. It was pure theater, but it worked, and many conservatives felt reassured. 2 days later, on March 23, 1933, the Reichstag met to vote on a law that would end German democracy. The law was officially called the Law to Remedy the Distress of People and Reich, but it became known as the Enabling Act. This law would transfer legislative power from Parliament to the Cabinet, which in practice meant Hitler alone would have the power to pass laws. Laws passed under the Enabling Act could even contradict the Constitution, meaning the Cabinet could change anything, Parliament would become irrelevant, and democracy would end. The Enabling Act required a 2/3 majority to pass, so Hitler needed to win over parties beyond the Nazis and their nationalist allies. The atmosphere in the Reichstag was intimidating, with SA and SS men packing the galleries, lining the halls, and standing outside the building. The Communist Party representatives could not vote because most had been arrested or were in hiding. Their 81 seats were simply declared vacant. The Social Democrats, led by Otto Wels, voted no. Wels gave a speech opposing the act, knowing the consequences but refusing to surrender democracy. The Social Democrats were the only party to vote against the Enabling Act, and they would pay dearly for their courage. The Catholic Center Party faced enormous pressure. Hitler had promised to respect the rights of the Catholic Church and to protect religious schools and organizations. Center Party leaders believed these promises, and they were wrong. But on March 23, 1933, the Center Party voted yes. Other conservative and middle-class parties also voted yes, with some believing Hitler's promises, some fearing SA violence, and some thinking they could still control events from within the system. The final vote was 444 in favor and 94 against. Only the Social Democrats voted no. With one vote, the Reichstag made itself irrelevant. Most Germans had never voted for Hitler in any free election, yet a minority used emergency powers and force to end the Republic. The Enabling Act was supposed to last 4 years, but it was renewed in 1937 and 1941 and remained in effect until Germany's defeat in 1945. During those 12 years, the Reichstag never again functioned as a real parliament. It became a rubber stamp, with representatives gathering occasionally only to applaud Hitler's speeches. The Enabling Act gave Hitler's dictatorship a legal appearance. He claimed he ruled through law, and his decrees had the force of legislation. The process looked legal on paper, but in reality, one man made all decisions without any check on his power. With emergency powers from the February 28th decree and legislative power from the Enabling Act, Hitler had all the tools he needed to destroy what remained of German democracy. The German word Gleichschaltung means coordination or bringing into line, and it described the process of forcing every institution in Germany to align with Nazi ideology. Between March 1933 and mid-1934, the Nazis destroyed all independent organizations and replaced them with Nazi-controlled versions. The first target was organized labor. Trade unions represented millions of workers and had both political power and financial resources. They were traditionally allied with the Social Democratic Party, and Hitler needed to crush them. May 1st was traditionally a day of labor celebrations, and in 1933 the Nazis made it a national holiday. They held massive celebrations honoring workers, and Hitler gave speeches praising the dignity of labor. Workers were told they were now valued partners in building the new Germany. The next day, May 2nd, 1933, the trap closed. At dawn, SA men occupied trade union offices across Germany. Leaders were arrested, funds were seized, newspapers were shut down, and files were confiscated. The entire organized labor movement collapsed in a single coordinated action. The Nazis replaced independent unions with the German Labor Front, a Nazi-controlled organization that workers had no choice but to join. They could not negotiate wages, they could not strike, and they had no rights. Next came political parties. The Communist Party had already been banned. The Social Democratic Party was outlawed on June 22, 1933. Other parties voluntarily dissolved under pressure. The Catholic Center Party dissolved itself on July 5, 1933, and the German National People's Party, Hitler's former coalition partner, dissolved on June 27, 1933. One by one, every political party except the Nazis disappeared. On July 14, 1933, the government passed the law against the formation of new parties, and Germany was now officially a single-party dictatorship. The Nazi Party was the only legal political organization, and anyone who tried to maintain a different party or form a new one faced arrest and prosecution for treason. In less than 6 months, Hitler had destroyed Germany's entire multi-party system. The federal structure of Germany was eliminated next. Germany had traditionally been divided into states called Länder, and each state had its own government, parliament, and constitution. This federal system limited central government power. On March 31, 1933, the government dissolved all state parliaments except Prussia's, and on April 7, 1933, the government appointed Reich governors for each state. These governors were all Nazis who answered directly to Hitler. State governments became powerless because they could not pass their own laws or resist national policies. On January 30, 1934, exactly 1 year after Hitler became Chancellor, a law abolished state parliaments completely. Germany became a centralized dictatorship where all power flowed from Berlin, and no regional government could resist. The churches presented a more complex challenge. Religion still mattered to millions of Germans, and direct confrontation with churches could create massive opposition, so Hitler moved more carefully here. On July 20, 1933, the Vatican signed a concordat with Nazi Germany. The concordat supposedly guaranteed the rights of the Catholic Church in Germany and protected Catholic schools and organizations. In return, the Church agreed to stay out of politics. The Nazis violated the Concordat almost immediately. Catholic organizations were harassed, church property was seized, and Catholic publications were censored. But the Concordat gave Hitler international legitimacy and silenced many Catholic leaders. The Church had chosen survival over resistance, and most clergy stayed quiet as dictatorship advanced. Protestant churches split. Some formed the German Christian movement, which embraced Nazi ideology and tried to blend Christianity with racial theories and German nationalism. Others formed the Confessing Church, which opposed Nazi interference in religion. Pastor Martin Niemöller led this resistance, and many confessing church pastors were arrested. Niemöller himself was eventually sent to concentration camps. But most pastors stayed silent, preached obedience to authority, and told their congregations to avoid politics. The educational system was completely taken over by the Nazis. Teachers were required to join the Nazi Teachers League, and those who refused lost their jobs. Jewish teachers were fired immediately. School curriculum was rewritten so that history glorified German military triumphs and promoted racial theories. Biology taught Nazi racial pseudoscience, and students learned that Aryans were superior and that Jews were dangerous. Physical education emphasized military training. Books were removed from libraries. On May 10, 1933, students held massive book burnings in university towns across Germany, burning works by Jewish authors, socialist writers, and anyone the Nazis considered degenerate. Thousands of books went into the flames. The Hitler Youth became the official state youth organization. Boys joined the Hitler Youth and girls joined the League of German Girls. Membership eventually became mandatory for all young Germans aged 10 to 18. By controlling education and youth, the Nazis shaped the next generation. Culture came under total control as well. On September 22, 1933, the Reich Chamber of Culture was created under Joseph Goebbels. The chamber had 7 subchambers covering fine arts, music, theater, literature, press, radio, and film. Anyone who wanted to work professionally in these fields had to be a member of the appropriate chamber. Jews were excluded, political dissidents were excluded, and anyone the regime disliked could be expelled, which meant they could no longer work. Expulsion from the chamber meant economic death because artists, writers, musicians, and journalists had no other way to earn a living. The message was clear: conform or starve. By the spring of 1934, Hitler faced a new problem. The SA, the brown-shirted street fighters who had helped him gain power, had become a liability. The SA numbered about 3 million men by 1934 and was led by Ernst Röhm, one of Hitler's oldest comrades who had been with him since the early days in Munich. Röhm was one of the few people who used the informal you with Hitler rather than the formal address. Röhm and many SA leaders wanted a second revolution. They had fought for National Socialism and now expected to see the movement's socialist promises fulfilled. They called for taking wealthy estates and insisted that the SA be merged into the regular army to become Germany's new military force. The German army despised this idea. Professional officers looked down on the SA as undisciplined thugs and had no intention of letting brown-shirted street brawlers take over the military. They threatened to withdraw their support from Hitler if he did not control Röhm. Business leaders and the middle class also wanted the SA restrained because SA violence was bad for business, and continued revolution talk frightened investors. Hitler faced a choice, and he chose to sacrifice Röhm and the SA. He needed the army's support because President Hindenburg was dying. When Hindenburg died, Hitler wanted to merge the offices of President and Chancellor, and he needed the army's backing to do this. The purge was planned carefully and given the code name Operation Hummingbird. Lists were prepared of people to be killed, and the lists included not just SA leaders, but also old enemies, potential threats, and people who knew too much about Hitler's past. On the night of June 29, 1934, Hitler flew to Bad Wiessee, a resort in southern Germany where Röhm and other SA leaders were vacationing. In the early morning hours of June 30th, Hitler personally led the arrests. Röhm was taken from his hotel room and placed under arrest. Initially, Hitler offered him a pistol to commit suicide, but Röhm refused and was shot in his cell by SS officers. Across Germany, SS and police squads executed people on the lists. The killing lasted from June 30th through July 2, 1934. Victims included SA leadership, former political enemies, and inconvenient witnesses to past crimes. Ernst Röhm was shot, along with dozens of senior SA officers. General Kurt von Schleicher, the former chancellor who had schemed against Hitler, was murdered at his home along with his wife. Gregor Strasser, the former Nazi leader who had challenged Hitler in 1932, was killed in his prison cell. Gustav von Kahr, who had stopped the 1923 beer hall putsch, was murdered and his body dumped in a swamp. Catholic leaders who had criticized the Nazis were killed, and even some who had been loyal to Hitler but knew embarrassing secrets were eliminated. At least 85 people were executed during the purge, though many historians believe the true total was higher. Many bodies were never found, and many murders were never recorded. The army provided the weapons, transportation, and target lists. Generals who wanted Schleicher dead got their wish. The army was now involved in state-sponsored murder and could no longer claim moral authority to oppose Hitler. On July 3, 1934, the cabinet met and retroactively legalized the killings. They passed a law declaring that the actions taken during the purge were legal measures necessary to defend the state. Murder became legal by decree. On July 13, 1934, Hitler addressed the Reichstag, defending the killings. He claimed Röhm had been planning a coup, said he had acted to save Germany from traitors, and declared himself the supreme judge of the German people. The Reichstag gave him a standing ovation. No one questioned his claim that he was above the law, and no one demanded evidence of Röhm's supposed coup. Historians have found no evidence of any actual SA coup plot, and most agree Hitler exaggerated or fabricated the threat to justify the purge. The lesson was clear. The regime had no limits. Legal protection no longer existed, and Hitler could order anyone killed at any time for any reason. No institution would stop him. President Paul von Hindenburg was dying. The 86-year-old field marshal had been ill for months, and by early August 1934, everyone knew the end was near. Hitler prepared carefully. On August 1, 1934, the day before Hindenburg died, the cabinet passed a law that merged the offices of president and chancellor. When Hindenburg died, Hitler would automatically become both head of state and head of government. The title would be neither president nor chancellor but Führer, meaning leader. Adolf Hitler would be Führer und Reichskanzler. On August 2, 1934, at 9 in the morning, Hindenburg died at his estate in East Prussia. Within hours, the new law took effect, and Hitler was now Führer of Germany. That same day, every member of the armed forces was required to take a new oath. Previously, they had sworn loyalty to the Constitution and the nation, but now their allegiance was pledged directly to Adolf Hitler himself. The army swore personal loyalty to Hitler, not to Germany, not to the Constitution, but to the man. This oath bound German officers for the rest of the Nazi regime. When they later wanted to oppose Hitler, they faced a moral dilemma because they had sworn before God to obey him personally. Breaking that oath meant violating a sacred vow. Many officers who privately opposed Hitler's decisions felt trapped by this oath. Some broke it and joined resistance movements, but most did not. The oath proved to be one of Hitler's most effective tools for controlling the military. On August 19, 1934, a plebiscite was held asking Germans to approve the merging of the two offices and Hitler's new role. The vote was held under conditions of total intimidation, with no free press, no opposition parties, and arrest awaiting anyone who spoke against the measure. The ballots were not truly secret because local committees could track how people voted. Some ballots were numbered with invisible ink, and in small towns and villages, everyone knew who voted which way. The pressure to vote yes was enormous. The official result showed 89.9% voted yes, while about 10% voted no or spoiled their ballots. Even in a climate of terror, about 4.5 million Germans risked punishment by voting no. But the result was used as proof that Germans supported Hitler, and the propaganda claimed the vote showed national unity. The Führer regime was now complete. One party, one leader, one will. The police state was formalized. On July 26, 1934, the SS was made independent of the SA and now reported only to Hitler. Heinrich Himmler, as Reichsführer SS, became one of the most powerful men in Germany. Reinhard Heydrich led the security service and would later control the Reich Main Security Office. These organizations operated outside legal limits and could arrest anyone, hold people indefinitely, and answered only to Himmler and Hitler. On June 17, 1936, all German law enforcement agencies were centralized under Himmler's command as he assumed the title of Chief of the German Police. The uniformed police and the Gestapo now operated together under full Nazi control. The Gestapo, the secret state police, became an instrument of terror. They had informants everywhere, and Germans never knew who might report them. A careless word could mean arrest. Children informed on parents, neighbors informed on neighbors, and co-workers informed on each other. Concentration camps filled with political prisoners, and by the late 1930s, 6 major camps held tens of thousands of people. These were not yet the death camps of the Holocaust. They were prisons for anyone the regime considered dangerous or undesirable. Inmates included communists, socialists, trade unionists, clergy who preached against the regime, Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to give the Hitler salute, homosexuals, and anyone who criticized the government. Jews were arrested in increasing numbers. By late 1934, Hitler's dictatorship was total. Anyone who resisted disappeared into camps, and anyone who spoke out vanished in the night. Yet most Germans did not experience the regime primarily as terror. For those who conformed, who were not Jewish and who stayed quiet, life seemed to improve. Unemployment dropped dramatically. In 1933, 6 million Germans were unemployed, but by 1936, unemployment fell below 1 million, and by 1937, Germany had nearly full employment. For people who had suffered through years of economic depression, this seemed like a miracle. The unemployment reduction came through several means. Massive public works programs, especially highway construction, provided jobs. Secret rearmament created factory work building weapons and military equipment. Women were pushed out of the workforce through propaganda and policy, and young men were conscripted into the military, removing them from unemployment statistics. The economic recovery was not sustainable because it was based on deficit spending aimed at preparing for war. The government printed money and manipulated currency, and economics minister Hjalmar Schacht used complex financial tricks to hide the true cost of rearmament. One trick involved MEFO bills, which were essentially IOUs that the government gave to arms manufacturers. These bills could be exchanged for money, but did not appear on government budgets, allowing massive military spending without revealing the full extent of rearmament. Germany developed 237 different exchange rates for its currency, with different rates applying to different transactions, allowing the government to manipulate trade and hide the weakness of the German economy. The economic miracle was a fraud, but it looked real to ordinary Germans who finally had jobs. The regime provided other benefits for those who conformed. The Strength Through Joy program offered subsidized vacations, concerts, theater tickets, and sports programs, allowing working-class Germans to afford entertainment that had previously been beyond their reach. The Volkswagen, or People's Car, was promised to German families, and workers could save toward purchasing one through a payment plan. The cars were never actually delivered to civilians because the factories built military vehicles instead, but the promise gave people hope and something to work toward. Living standards improved for many. Those who kept quiet and fit the Aryan mold got jobs, housing, and social programs. The regime delivered material benefits in exchange for obedience, but the price was freedom. Workers could not negotiate wages, they could not strike. They worked long hours, and they had no labor rights. For Jews, the price was everything. While Aryan Germans saw improvements, Jews faced increasing persecution, and most Germans chose not to see the cost. They accepted the benefits and ignored what was happening to their neighbors. The persecution of Jews began immediately after Hitler took power, starting with economic exclusion and social isolation. It would end in genocide. On April 1, 1933, the Nazis organized a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. SA men stood outside Jewish shops with signs reading, "Germans, defend yourselves, don't buy from Jews." The boycott officially lasted only one day because international criticism forced the Nazis to end it publicly, but the message was sent. Jews were targets. On April 7, 1933, the government passed the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which allowed the government to fire civil servants who were Jewish or politically unreliable. Thousands of Jewish teachers, professors, judges, and government employees lost their jobs. The law included a temporary exception for Jews who had fought for Germany in World War I or who had lost family members in the war, but this exception would not last long. Jewish doctors lost their right to treat patients covered by state insurance, Jewish lawyers were disbarred, and Jewish journalists were fired. Step by step, Jews were pushed out of professional life. On September 15, 1935, the government announced the Nuremberg Laws at the annual Nazi Party rally. These laws formalized the persecution. The Reich citizenship law declared that Jews were no longer citizens, but subjects without political rights. The law for the protection of German blood and honor banned marriages between Jews and non-Jews, prohibited sexual relations between Jews and Germans, and made these acts punishable by imprisonment. The laws defined who was considered Jewish based on ancestry. Having 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents made someone fully Jewish, while having 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents created complex categories. Religious conversion made no difference because Nazi racial theory was based on blood, not belief. The Nuremberg Laws destroyed any pretense of equality before the law, and Jews were officially second-class subjects in their own country. Between 1936 and 1937, economic persecution intensified through a process called Aryanization. Jewish businesses were forced to sell to non-Jewish Germans at far below market value. This was legalized theft. Jewish professionals lost their licenses, with Jewish doctors only able to treat Jewish patients, Jewish lawyers only able to represent Jewish clients, and Jewish teachers unable to work in schools. In 1938, the persecution accelerated. Jews were required to carry identity cards marked with a J. In August, Jewish men were required to add Israel to their names, and Jewish women had to add Sarah. This made identification and discrimination easier. Jews were required to register all their assets, and the government compiled lists of who owned what, preparing the way for systematic confiscation. Social exclusion became total. Signs appeared everywhere. Jews not welcome, Jews strictly forbidden in this town, and Jews enter this place at their own risk. Parks, pools, theaters, restaurants, and hotels banned Jews. Grocery stores refused to sell food to Jews. Pharmacies would not provide medicine, and even milk was sometimes denied to Jewish families. By 1938, about half of German Jews had no way to earn a living. The 1936 Olympics in Berlin provided a brief pause. Hitler ordered anti-Jewish signs removed temporarily to impress foreign visitors. The moment the Olympics ended, the persecution resumed with greater intensity. In 18 months, from January 1933 to mid-1934, Adolf Hitler transformed Germany from a democracy into a dictatorship. He did it legally, using laws, decrees, and emergency powers. He used terror and violence, but he gave it all a legal appearance. Crucially, none of this rested on a democratic majority. Most Germans had never voted for Hitler in any free election. The Reichstag fire decree suspended civil liberties permanently. The Enabling Act made Parliament irrelevant. Gleichschaltung destroyed all independent organizations. The Night of the Long Knives showed there were no limits to state violence. Hindenburg's death allowed Hitler to merge all executive power in himself, and the oath bound the military to him personally. Every institution that should have defended democracy either collaborated or was destroyed. The army made deals, the judges enforced Nazi laws, the police became instruments of terror, the churches mostly stayed silent, and the universities purged their faculties and taught Nazi ideology. The conservative politicians who thought they could control Hitler were dead, in exile, or completely powerless. Franz von Papen, who had bragged about hiring Hitler, barely escaped death during the Night of the Long Knives and learned to stay silent and count himself lucky to be alive. Millions of Germans accepted the dictatorship. Some enthusiastically supported it, while others accepted it passively because they had jobs and order and the appearance of prosperity. Many convinced themselves the worst was over and that the regime would moderate once it consolidated power. They were wrong. The worst had not even begun. By 1934, Germany was a one-party state with a police apparatus that answered to no law. Courts existed only to enforce the Führer's will. No opposition was tolerated, and any dissent meant imprisonment or death. Jews faced systematic exclusion from German economic and social life. They could not work. They could not own businesses, and they were not citizens. They were being pushed out of Germany entirely, but most countries would not accept Jewish refugees. Jews were trapped. The persecution would grow worse. The Nuremberg laws were just the beginning. Economic exclusion would become violent pogrom. Pogrom would become deportation, and deportation would become industrialized mass murder. The destruction of German democracy teaches essential lessons. Democracies seldom fall to military coups. Instead, they die when institutions abandon democratic norms, when courts enforce unjust laws, when police serve tyrants over the people, and when good citizens remain silent. Germany's democracy died legally through emergency decrees and parliamentary votes, through compromises and backroom deals. It died because people believed they could control extremism while using it for their own purposes. By the time Germans realized what they had lost, it was too late. The dictatorship was complete, and the stage was set for catastrophe. Section 4. War and Destruction. Hitler began preparing for war the moment he gained power, though he did it secretly at first while speaking publicly about peace. Behind this facade of diplomacy, he was building the largest military machine in Europe. In 1933, Germany spent 1.9 billion marks on the military, about 4% of the national economy. By 1936, that number had reached 5.8 billion marks, and by 1938, it had grown to 17.2 billion marks, representing 52% of all government spending. This level of military spending was not sustainable because the German economy was being reorganized entirely for war, and Hitler had no intention of maintaining a long peace. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was supposed to have an army of only 100,000 men, but Hitler ignored this limit from the beginning. The army expanded in secret, with training camps disguised as sports facilities, and officers training in the Soviet Union, while plans for tanks and aircraft were developed despite the treaty ban. On January 13, 1935, the Saar region held a vote on its future after being under League of Nations control since the end of World War I, and 90% chose to return to Germany. This was a legitimate result since the vote had been scheduled by treaty and conducted fairly. But Hitler used this success as cover for his next move. In March 1935, he publicly announced the restoration of military conscription, openly defying the Treaty of Versailles. Britain and France protested, but they took no action to stop him. And this response taught Hitler a crucial lesson. On May 21, 1935, Hitler gave a major speech to the Reichstag in which he spoke about peace, claimed Germany wanted only equality with other nations, offered to negotiate arms limitations, and even proposed a naval agreement with Britain. The speech was a masterpiece of deception because Hitler posed as a reasonable statesman while building the largest military in Europe, and many people wanted to believe him because war had been so terrible that another conflict seemed unthinkable. Leaders in Britain and France convinced themselves that Hitler could be satisfied, and Britain signed a naval agreement with Germany in June 1935 that allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35% of British naval strength. This agreement violated the Treaty of Versailles, but Britain chose to negotiate rather than enforce the treaty, teaching Hitler that he could violate treaties and face only protests while his actions brought results. On March 7, 1936, Hitler made his boldest gamble yet when German troops marched into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone between Germany and France, where no German soldiers were supposed to be under the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties. His generals were terrified because Germany's military was still weak, and if France had sent troops, Germany would have been forced to retreat. Hitler himself later admitted that French opposition would have meant withdrawal, but neither France nor Britain took any action, allowing Hitler's gamble to succeed completely. The remilitarization of the Rhineland marked a turning point that changed the balance of power in Europe. German prestige soared, Hitler's judgment seemed brilliant to his generals, and they began to follow his lead without question. Germany could now fortify its western border, fundamentally changing the strategic situation in Europe. In November 1936, Hitler created the four-year plan with Hermann Göring in charge, aiming to make Germany self-sufficient in key resources and ready for war within 4 years. Synthetic fuel and rubber production were prioritized as the German economy was bent entirely toward military preparation. When Economics Minister Hjalmar Schacht warned that this level of military spending would bankrupt Germany, Hitler dismissed his concerns and gradually pushed Schacht aside. Hitler was not planning for sustainable economic growth, but rather for conquest that would pay for itself through plunder. In November 1937, Hitler held a secret meeting with his military and foreign policy leaders, and a record of the meeting was later prepared by Colonel Friedrich Hossbach. At what became known as the Hossbach Conference, Hitler told the assembled officers that Germany must expand and that living space in Eastern Europe was essential. He named his first targets as Austria and Czechoslovakia while stating he was willing to risk war with Britain and France. Several of those present were shocked, with War Minister Werner von Blomberg, Army Commander Werner von Fritsch, and Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath all expressing concerns, but Hitler did not appreciate their doubts. In early 1938, Hitler moved against anyone who might restrain him. Blomberg was forced to resign over a marriage scandal, Fritsch was framed with false evidence and removed from command, and Neurath was replaced as foreign minister by the more obedient Joachim von Ribbentrop. Hitler abolished the war ministry entirely and created the high command of the armed forces under his direct control while promoting officers who would not question his decisions. Economics Minister Schacht was also pushed aside as Hermann Göring's four-year plan organization took control of economic policy. By February 1938, Hitler had complete control over military and foreign policy, with no institution capable of checking him. Austria was Hitler's first target because he had been born there and believed all German-speaking peoples should be united in one nation. Annexing Austria would add 7 million people and valuable resources to Germany. The Austrian government, led by Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg, tried to maintain independence, but Austria had its own Nazi movement supported by Berlin, and pressure from Germany increased throughout 1937. On February 12, 1938, Hitler summoned Schuschnigg to his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden for a meeting designed to intimidate. Hitler ranted and threatened invasion while demanding that Austrian Nazis be brought into the government, specifically that Arthur Seyss-Inquart be made interior minister with control over police. Schuschnigg felt trapped and agreed under pressure, but after returning to Austria, he tried one last desperate move by calling for a vote to be held on March 13, 1938, in which Austrians would decide whether their country should remain independent. Hitler was enraged because he could not allow a free vote that might reject unification. On March 11, 1938, Germany issued demands that Schuschnigg resign, that Seyss-Inquart become Chancellor, and that the vote be cancelled. When Austrian President Wilhelm Miklas initially resisted appointing Seyss-Inquart, Hermann Göring threatened invasion by phone until Miklas finally gave in. Seyss-Inquart became Chancellor and immediately requested German military assistance to restore order, even though there was no disorder, but the excuse had been established. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the Austrian border and met no resistance as many Austrians welcomed them with church bells ringing, crowds cheering, and Nazi flags appearing everywhere. Hitler himself crossed into Austria that day to visit his childhood home in Braunau am Inn before traveling to Linz, where he had gone to school, and on March 15th he entered Vienna in triumph. The annexation, called the Anschluss, was declared complete, and Austria ceased to exist as an independent nation. On April 10, 1938, a vote was held throughout Germany in Austria asking citizens to approve the annexation, with the result showing 99.7% in favor. However, the vote was not free since it was held under Nazi control with no secret ballot in many areas, SA men watching polling stations, and arrest awaiting anyone who spoke against annexation. Despite this, genuine enthusiasm did exist because many Austrians were ethnic Germans who wanted to be part of a greater Germany. Many welcomed the end of Austria's economic depression, and many hated the Austrian government and hoped for change. But the immediate reality was brutal as violence erupted against Jews within hours of German troops arriving. Jewish homes and businesses were looted. Jews were forced to scrub streets on their hands and knees while crowds mocked them, and Jewish professionals were beaten in public. The Austrian Nazi movement unleashed years of resentment in a wave of humiliation that represented part of the regime's hateful ideology, which we now recognize as a gross violation of human rights. Western powers protested the annexation but took no other action, and Hitler had won again. Czechoslovakia was next, and unlike Austria, this was a democratic nation with a strong army and alliance treaties with France and the Soviet Union. It seemed a harder target, but Czechoslovakia had a weakness in that about 3 million ethnic Germans lived in the Sudetenland, the border region with Germany, and Hitler could use these people as an excuse for intervention. Konrad Henlein led the Sudeten German Party and took orders from Berlin, making increasingly impossible demands on the Czechoslovak government. Whatever Prague offered, Henlein demanded more because the goal was not compromise but crisis. Throughout 1938, Hitler made increasingly aggressive speeches about the Sudetenland, claiming Germans there were being oppressed while threatening military action to protect them as German troops massed on the border. Europe came to the brink of war, and France and Britain had to decide whether to honor their commitments to Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed war could be avoided through negotiation, so he flew to Germany 3 times to meet with Hitler in an unprecedented move for a British Prime Minister. At their first meeting on September 15, 1938 at Berchtesgaden, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, and Chamberlain said he would consult his cabinet. At their second meeting on September 22 at Bad Godesberg, Hitler increased his demands by wanting immediate occupation and imposing time limits. War seemed certain as France mobilized, Britain prepared, and Czechoslovak President Edvard Beneš ordered mobilization. At the last moment, Benito Mussolini proposed a conference that would decide Czechoslovakia's fate without Czechoslovakia being present. On September 29th to 30th, 1938, leaders of Germany, Britain, France, and Italy met in Munich while neither Czechoslovakia nor the Soviet Union was invited. The Munich Agreement gave Hitler everything he wanted, with Germany occupying the Sudetenland, Poland, and Hungary taking their claimed territories, and Czechoslovakia being torn apart. Chamberlain returned to London and declared he had achieved peace for our time while waiving the signed agreement and claiming it guaranteed peace in Europe. But the Munich Agreement destroyed Czechoslovakia by stripping it of its border defenses and industrial heartland, leaving it virtually defenseless while the country lost all faith in its Western allies. Many historians view Munich as the low point of appeasement because Britain and France abandoned an ally to avoid war, believing they could satisfy Hitler's demands and convincing themselves he would stop after getting the Sudetenland. They were wrong, and Hitler despised them for their weakness. On March 15, 1939, just 6 months after Munich, German troops occupied Prague as Slovakia declared independence as a German puppet state, and Bohemia and Moravia became a German protectorate. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist, and the mask came off because this was not about self-determination for Germans, but rather about conquest. Britain and France finally realized they had been deceived and that war was now inevitable. On March 31, 1939, Britain guaranteed Poland's independence, with France joining this guarantee, meaning that if Germany attacked Poland, both nations would declare war. Hitler did not believe them because they had abandoned Czechoslovakia, so why would Poland be different? On March 22, 1939, Germany seized Memel from Lithuania, taking more territory through intimidation and meeting no resistance, which confirmed the pattern. Hitler demanded territory, threatened war, and Western powers either gave him what he wanted or did nothing, causing his confidence to grow with each success. But the next demand would trigger the war that would destroy him and most of Europe. Hitler wanted Danzig and the Polish corridor, with Danzig being a free city populated mostly by Germans, and the Polish corridor being the strip of land that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. Unlike Austria and Czechoslovakia, Poland refused Hitler's demands because Polish leaders knew that giving in meant eventual destruction, and Poland was prepared to fight. Hitler faced one problem in that he feared a two-front war and needed to neutralize the Soviet Union. Publicly, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia were bitter enemies since Hitler had spent years denouncing communism. But privately, negotiations began in August 1939. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact meant that sworn enemies had suddenly become partners, with the treaty including secret agreements dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split between them, the Baltic states would go to the Soviet Union, and Romania's Bessarabia region would go to the Soviets as Germany and Russia carved up the region between them. Stalin believed the pact bought time to build up Soviet strength while Germany fought the West, and Hitler believed the pact gave him freedom to attack Poland without Soviet interference. On August 25, 1939, Britain and Poland signed a formal treaty of mutual assistance, proving that Britain was not bluffing and the guarantee was real. Hitler had already set the invasion date for August 26th, but when he learned of the British-Polish treaty, he postponed the attack and tried diplomatic moves to split Britain from Poland, all of which failed. On September 1, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, German forces invaded Poland after claiming that Polish forces had attacked a German radio station at Gliwice. This was actually a staged event in which SS men in Polish uniforms had created a fake attack to provide an excuse, and with this invasion, World War II had begun. German forces used new tactics as tanks and mechanized infantry broke through Polish lines, while the Luftwaffe destroyed Polish planes on the ground and bombed cities, causing the campaign to move with shocking speed. Britain issued an ultimatum demanding that Germany withdraw from Poland or face war, but the ultimatum was ignored, and on September 3, 1939, at 11 a.m., Britain declared war on Germany, with France declaring war that same afternoon at 5 p.m. World War II now involved Europe's major powers, but Britain and France could not help Poland militarily because Poland was too far away. By the time British and French forces could mobilize, Poland would be overrun. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east to implement Stalin's part of the secret agreement, leaving Poland facing enemies on both sides. By the end of September, Poland was defeated, with Warsaw surrendering on September 27th and Poland being divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, while the Polish government fled into exile. In occupied Poland, Nazi authorities immediately began systematic oppression as the SS and police murdered Polish intellectuals, priests, and political leaders, with the goal of destroying Poland's leadership class. Jews were herded into ghettos, with the largest in Warsaw, where hundreds of thousands of Jews were forced into sealed districts with inadequate food, housing, and sanitation, while disease and starvation killed thousands. This was just the beginning, as the occupation of Poland would become a testing ground for Nazi racial policy and genocide. After crushing Poland, Germany turned west during what became known as the Phony War that lasted through winter 1939 to 1940, with little fighting on the Western Front as both sides prepared. In April 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, with Denmark falling in hours and Norway resisting but being defeated within weeks. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched its western offensive as German forces attacked through the Ardennes forest, bypassing French defenses and overrunning Belgium and the Netherlands, while the French army was outflanked and defeated. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk, where a desperate evacuation rescued over 300,000 troops but lost all their heavy equipment. Paris fell on June 14, 1940, and on June 22, 1940, France signed a surrender agreement in the same railway car where Germany had signed the 1918 armistice, allowing Hitler to savor the revenge. Hitler was at the peak of his power, with Germany dominating Europe from Norway to Spain, and only Britain still fighting. Britain seemed helpless, and Hitler wanted to invade through Operation Sea Lion, but Germany needed control of the skies first. The Battle of Britain raged through summer and fall 1940, but the Luftwaffe failed to destroy the Royal Air Force, while the Royal Navy remained far stronger than Germany's navy, making invasion impossible. Hitler then turned his attention east and made the decision that would ultimately destroy Nazi Germany. On December 18, 1940, Hitler signed Directive 21, codenamed Operation Barbarossa, scheduling the invasion of the Soviet Union for spring 1941 because Hitler believed the Soviet Union could be defeated in a quick campaign before winter. On March 30, 1941, Hitler addressed his generals and explained that this would not be a conventional military campaign, but rather a war of annihilation, a racial war, and an ideological war. Soviet political officers called commissars were to be shot upon capture under the Commissar Order. Civilians who resisted could be executed without trial, and normal rules of war did not apply. German generals knew these orders were criminal, and while some objected, most accepted them or remained silent, convincing themselves that exceptional circumstances justified exceptional measures. They were preparing to participate in crimes on a massive scale. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941, with over 3 million German soldiers invading the Soviet Union along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea in the largest invasion in human history. German forces advanced rapidly as huge encirclements trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, while Minsk, Smolensk, and other cities fell as German armies drove toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. Behind the advancing German forces came special units called Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads whose mission was to murder Jews, communist officials, and anyone else deemed dangerous by Nazi ideology. The Einsatzgruppen entered towns and villages, rounded up Jews, marched victims to forests or ravines, shot them, and buried them in mass graves as thousands of people were murdered every day. The German army provided transportation, supplies, and sometimes personnel to support these operations, with regular army units sometimes participating in massacres. Many officers and soldiers knew what was happening, yet few tried to stop it. These mass killings were crimes against humanity that we must never forget or allow to happen again. By October 1941, German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow, and the capital seemed within reach. But the advance stalled as Soviet resistance stiffened. Supply lines were stretched too far, and the Russian winter arrived early with brutal cold. German soldiers were not equipped for winter warfare, lacking warm clothing, while vehicles froze and weapons stopped working as frostbite and disease devastated units. In December 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive that pushed German forces back from Moscow, and the quick victory Hitler had promised did not happen. On December 5, 1941, the German advance stopped permanently, meaning the Soviet Union would not be defeated quickly, and the war would last for years. Hitler refused to allow retreats and issued the halt order forbidding withdrawals while dismissing generals who disagreed. On December 19, 1941, Hitler took personal command of the army, making all major decisions himself. 5 days earlier, on December 11, 1941, Hitler had made another fatal decision by declaring war on the United States after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Germany was now fighting the Soviet Union, Britain, and America simultaneously, making the war unwinnable because Germany faced the world's largest industrial powers. But Hitler believed he could still prevail through willpower alone. The persecution of Jews that had begun with boycotts and laws escalated into systematic mass murder. The process was gradual, with Jews being excluded from professions in 1933, losing citizenship in 1935, facing economic theft and violent attacks in 1938, and being forced into ghettos in 1939. In 1941, the killing became systematic when the Einsatzgruppen began shooting Jews in huge numbers during the invasion of the Soviet Union, with hundreds of thousands dying in the first months. But shooting was inefficient, psychologically difficult for the killers, and left evidence, so the Nazi leadership wanted a faster, more secret method of mass murder. The answer was industrial killing facilities disguised as labor or transit camps, and the technique had been tested earlier when Hitler signed a secret authorization in October 1939 for what was called the T4 program. Doctors selected disabled Germans for killing, and about 70,000 mentally ill and physically disabled people were murdered using carbon monoxide gas. The T4 program provided technical knowledge as personnel learned how to use gas, dispose of bodies, and maintain secrecy. In September 1941, the first experiments with Zyklon B gas took place at Auschwitz concentration camp. Zyklon B was a pesticide that released cyanide gas and killed quickly and efficiently, and by late 1941 and early 1942, dedicated extermination camps were built. Chelmno opened in December 1941, with Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka following in 1942, while Auschwitz-Birkenau was expanded to include gas chambers and crematoria. On January 20, 1942, Nazi officials met at a villa in Wannsee, a suburb of Berlin, with Reinhard Heydrich chairing the meeting and 15 high-ranking bureaucrats attending. They discussed the final solution to the Jewish question, though the Wannsee Conference did not decide to begin the Holocaust because mass murder was already underway. Instead, the conference coordinated different government departments so that transportation, property seizure, and administration would work together efficiently. The minutes of the meeting used code words, with evacuation, meaning deportation, and special treatment, meaning murder, and while the language was deliberately vague, everyone present understood what was being discussed. Jews across Europe were to be deported to camps in Poland, where most would be murdered immediately upon arrival. The process was systematic as Jews were rounded up in their home countries and transported in cattle cars to camps. The journey took days, with hundreds of people crammed into each car without food, water, or sanitation, and many died during transport. Upon arrival, victims were divided on the platform, with those selected for labor being registered and sent to barracks, while the majority were sent directly to gas chambers that were disguised as shower rooms. Victims were told they were being disinfected and ordered to undress before being herded into sealed rooms where Zyklon B pellets were dropped through vents, releasing cyanide gas that brought death within minutes. The scale was industrial, with Auschwitz-Birkenau capable of murdering up to 6,000 people in a single day. Over the course of the war, about 1.1 million people were killed at Auschwitz alone, most of them Jews. Treblinka, Belzec, and Sobibor were pure death factories where almost everyone sent there was murdered immediately, with about 1.7 million people dying at these three camps combined. The total Holocaust death toll was about 6 million Jews, representing approximately 2/3 of European Jews. Entire communities disappeared, and centuries of Jewish life in Europe were destroyed. The Nazis also murdered millions of others, including about 500,000 Roma people, while Soviet prisoners of war died by the millions, mostly through deliberate starvation and exposure. Polish civilians were murdered in huge numbers, and disabled people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and political prisoners were killed. The total number of people murdered in Nazi camps and killing operations was approximately 11 million to 17 million, depending on which categories are included. This was not war, but industrialized genocide, one of the worst crimes in human history. In 1942, Hitler attempted to regain the initiative in the East by launching Operation Blue, aiming to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus. German armies drove south toward the Volga River and the city of Stalingrad, and Hitler became obsessed with capturing Stalingrad because the city bore Stalin's name, and taking it would be a psychological and propaganda victory. He ordered that the city be taken at all costs. German forces reached Stalingrad in August 1942, and brutal urban warfare began as soldiers fought for every building, every floor, and every room, with the city becoming a nightmare of rubble and death. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, attacking the weak Romanian and Italian armies, protecting the German flanks. And within days, Soviet forces encircled the entire German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. Over 250,000 German and Axis soldiers were trapped, with General Friedrich Paulus commanding the Sixth Army and requesting permission to break out, but Hitler refused and ordered the army to hold its position. Hermann Göring promised that the Luftwaffe could supply the encircled army by air, but this was impossible because the Luftwaffe could not deliver enough supplies, and German soldiers starved and froze. On January 30, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to field marshal because no German field marshal had ever surrendered, expecting Paulus to fight to the death or commit suicide. But on January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered, and on February 2, 1943, the last German forces in Stalingrad laid down their weapons. About 91,000 German soldiers marched into Soviet captivity, and most would die in prison camps. Stalingrad was the turning point that shattered the myth of German invincibility. Germany had lost the strategic initiative, and meanwhile in North Africa, British forces defeated the Germans at El Alamein in October and November 1942, while American and British forces landed in North Africa in Operation Torch on November 8, 1942. The Africa Corps was trapped, and by May 1943, Axis forces in Africa surrendered. In July 1943, Germany launched one final offensive in the east at Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, but the offensive failed and Soviet forces counterattacked. From this point forward, Germany would only retreat. Also in July 1943, American and British forces invaded Sicily. Mussolini was overthrown on July 25, 1943, and the new Italian government signed a surrender agreement with the Allies in September, meaning Germany's main ally had collapsed. Strategic bombing of Germany intensified as British bombers attacked at night and American bombers attacked during the day. German cities burned, with Hamburg destroyed in a firestorm in July 1943, disrupting industrial production and cracking civilian morale. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy, opening a second front in the west. German forces in France fought hard but could not stop the advance, and Paris was liberated in August 1944. In the east, the Soviet summer offensive called Operation Bagration destroyed German Army Group Center, with about 450,000 German soldiers killed or captured as the Red Army advanced toward Germany's borders. On July 20, 1944, German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg planted a bomb at Hitler's headquarters, but Hitler survived because a table leg had shielded him. The assassination plot collapsed, thousands were arrested and hundreds were executed. But while the failed attempt tightened Hitler's control, it showed that even within the military, opposition existed. In December 1944, Germany launched a desperate counteroffensive in the Ardennes forest that would prove to be its last. The Battle of the Bulge surprised Allied forces initially, but the offensive failed and Germany's last reserves were spent. The war was lost. In January 1945, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive, crossed into Germany, and advanced toward Berlin with nothing capable of stopping them. In March 1945, American forces crossed the Rhine River while British and Canadian forces advanced into northern Germany as Germany was crushed from east and west. Hitler issued orders for scorched earth, meaning all infrastructure was to be destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But Armaments Minister Albert Speer quietly ignored these orders because Germany would need these facilities after the war. By April 1945, Berlin was surrounded, and Hitler refused to leave the city, retreating to the Führer bunker, an underground shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery. The bunker was cramped and damp, smelling of diesel fumes, and Hitler spent his final weeks there, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed while moving phantom divisions on maps and believing victory was still possible. Eva Braun, Hitler's longtime companion, joined him in the bunker and refused offers to leave, choosing to die with him. On April 20, 1945, Hitler's 56th birthday, he briefly appeared above ground to inspect Hitler Youth defenders, boys as young as 12 being sent to fight Soviet tanks. It was his last public appearance as Soviet artillery pounded Berlin and Soviet infantry advanced block by block, closing in on the government district. On April 28, 1945, Hitler learned that Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS and his most loyal follower, had tried to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. Hitler was enraged and ordered Himmler arrested, though the order could not be carried out. On April 29, 1945, after midnight, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief civil ceremony before dictating his political testament, in which he blamed the Jews for the war, appointed Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor, and ordered the fight to continue. He took no responsibility for anything, and to the end, he blamed others. On April 30, 1945, around 3:30 p.m., Adolf Hitler killed himself. Eva bit into a cyanide capsule while Hitler shot himself in the head. Their bodies were carried into the Reich Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline, and burned as Soviet artillery continued to fall. The bodies were only partially cremated before the flames died down, and the remains were buried in a shell crater. Joseph Goebbels became Chancellor for one day before he and his wife poisoned their 6 children on May 1, 1945, and then committed suicide. On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrendered to Soviet forces, German forces in Italy having already surrendered on April 29. On May 7, 1945, Germany signed an unconditional surrender at Reims, and the surrender was repeated in Berlin on May 8, 1945. World War II in Europe was over, and the Third Reich had lasted 12 years and 3 months. The final accounting was catastrophic. World War II killed an estimated 75 million people, with scholarly estimates ranging from 70 to 85 million. About 6 million Jews were systematically murdered in the Holocaust, and millions more were killed in camps, during massacres, or through deliberate starvation. 27 million Soviet citizens died, along with 6 million Poles, hundreds of thousands of Roma, millions of Soviet prisoners of war, and countless civilians across Europe. German cities lay in ruins. The German economy was destroyed, and the country was divided and occupied. Hitler had promised a 1,000-year Reich, but he delivered 12 years of dictatorship, 6 years of war, and total destruction. He had promised to restore German greatness, but left Germany divided, occupied, and devastated. He had promised to solve the Jewish question, but committed the worst genocide in history. Every promise was a lie, every victory was temporary, and every success led to greater catastrophe. The pattern was clear from the beginning: a man who blamed everyone else for his failures, who craved absolute control, who used hatred as a tool, and who believed might made right. The question is not just what happened, but how it happened. How did educated people, modern institutions, and millions of ordinary citizens enable this catastrophe? That question has answers that matter more than ever, because the patterns that brought Hitler to power did not die with him in that bunker. Understanding how democracies fail, how hatred becomes genocide, how ordinary people become complicit, and how institutions betray their purpose is not just history. This is a warning, because those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. Section 5. The Warning Signs. The question remains, how did this happen? Hitler did not rise alone. He was enabled by weak institutions, desperate citizens, and elites who believed they could control him. No single factor explains everything, but together these forces created the conditions that allowed a fringe political figure to seize total power within a modern democracy. The Holocaust did not begin with camps. It began with words and laws. It started with scapegoating, then with laws that removed citizenship from targeted groups, and each step made the next one easier to accept. What seemed unthinkable in 1933 had become government policy by 1938. The regime's racist ideology led to the deaths of 6 million Jews, along with millions of Roma, disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war, and others. Behind every number was a person with a family, a life, and a future that was taken from them. The Holocaust also required participation from thousands of ordinary people, bureaucrats, railway workers, police, and guards, many of whom convinced themselves they were just doing their jobs. History shows that under certain conditions, ordinary people can enable terrible things, not because they are inherently cruel, but because they follow authority without question. Certain patterns tend to appear before democratic systems break down. Scapegoating is often the first sign, when politicians blame complex problems on a single group. Then comes division of society into real citizens and others. Attacks on independent media follow. Political violence gets excused rather than condemned. Emergency powers meant to be temporary become permanent, as the Reichstag fire decree did for 12 years. Courts and institutions lose independence, and leaders demand personal loyalty rather than loyalty to law. These patterns appeared in Germany, but they are not unique to Germany. They have appeared in other places and other times. At every stage, people made choices. Hindenburg chose to appoint Hitler. Conservatives chose to make deals with him. Judges enforced unjust laws. Police served the regime. Soldiers followed orders they knew were wrong. Citizens stayed silent. Each individual choice seemed small or unavoidable at the time, but collectively they made catastrophe possible. Democracies survive when citizens stay engaged, when the press remains independent, when courts uphold the law equally, when executive power has limits, and when people are willing to speak up even when it is uncomfortable to do so. Hitler's story ended in 1945, but the conditions that allowed his rise were not unique to that era. Economic crisis, political instability, institutional weakness, and public indifference can combine in any society. The survivors who testified about what they experienced did so because they wanted future generations to understand how it happened. Preventing it requires recognizing the warning signs and taking them seriously before it is too late. However, understanding how Hitler rose to power is only part of the story. The question of why he chose to start World War II involves different factors: military calculations, ideological imperatives, and economic pressures that made war seem inevitable to him. To learn the real reasons Hitler had to start World War II, check this next video.